So now that the intro's over and you have Visual Studio downloaded, we're going to get into a more impromptu kind of style of these videos. I'm just going to talk about what we're doing for each unit as I go along and demonstrate in Visual Studio itself exactly what's going on. So because this is our first time doing it, I'm going to go ahead and go through creating a project with you. So on my start page, I see something that's a little bit different than what you're going to see. Specifically, I have a whole bunch of projects that I've worked on. It knows recent project templates, things that I've done before, but you're going to probably see something similar that has a create new project button. So you're going to go ahead and click that. So when this page comes up, again, I'm going to have a lot more over here because I have a whole bunch of extra things installed in my Visual Studio, but you're going to find the thing that says Visual C Sharp, and then in this, you're going to find the thing that says console app.net framework. This is what we're going to want to create. This creates a simple console app, just a regular black box with text in it. That's what we're going to be using for this course. It gives us everything we need to learn the basics. It allows us to debug, print things out, everything we need, simple stuff. So select this, and then wherever you want to save it, very important, save it in somewhere you're going to remember. So for me, I'm going to go to my summer class, VS Projects, select folder, and then I'm going to name it. This is our system and out section, so I'm going to call it system.io. So now our project's created, and Visual Studio is going to give us the most basic start here kind of layout. We don't have to worry about starting from absolute scratch. It gives us what we need to begin with. So let's just kind of go over some of the things that we're looking at here. So first off, we're not going to need any of this stuff over here, so I'm going to go and close it so we have more to look at. So first off, you can see how these up here are kind of grayed out. These are called the using directives. This is including these libraries into my code. So for example, in this unit, we're going to be talking about the console and output and stuff like that. So if I type console.writeLine and just close it off like this is a line of code. All it does is write enter. When you press enter in a Word document or something, it just tabs to the next line. That's what this does. But you can see when I put that in here, this line right here became normal colors. It's not grayed out. This is indicating that I'm using this system reference by calling this line of code. Now let's go ahead and take this out. So I deleted that, and now you can see it has an error. The name console does not exist in the current context. I'm no longer including the library that console is a part of. So that's why I need that up there. In this situation as well, because if you look over here to my references, I have system as a reference. I can do this. But, this is kind of ugly. This is too much code. I want to simplify it. And I know I'm going to be using system for a lot of stuff. So I'm going to say using system up here, I'm going to keep it up here. I'm going to remove this, so now I can console writeLine. But let's go ahead and get rid of that and go back to where we were. Namespace is a way of organizing your code. Similar how up here I'm using system, I'm using, system.collections.generic, I'm using all these things. This namespace right here, if I was to create another class with another namespace, I could go up here and say using system.io. This is a reference to my class. However, this class is itself, it's in its own namespace, so there's no reason to reference it. But that's what a namespace is. Programs can run without a namespace. You can just run them like this if you want to. I generally find that there's no real reason to do that. Just keep it like this. It's clean, it's easy. As you start getting into bigger projects, using namespaces will start to make sense. So the next part is a class. In object-oriented programming, a class is generally referred to an instance of an object. When I run this code, if I press start, well, I need to start without debugging. Give me a second. Okay, so I need to go build, start without debugging. So Control F5. If you guys see a box appear like this, it's because I pressed Control F5 from here on out. But here's our program. Our program is very interesting, right? It does absolutely nothing. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. But that's what this is. It's an instance of an object. Somewhere in our program, we have the class program object that's going to do things. Now, this right here is called a method. So what a method is it's kind of like it's a function to call. You know, think of you with all your math skills, all your algebra skills, all your geometry skills. You know some formulas. You know, these formulas are all tools in your tool belt per se that you can call whenever you need them. Whenever you need them, you can recollect them. You can use the formula, apply it, and then put it back on your tool belt. That's what a method is. This method in particular is the main method. This is where your program starts. So when I come in here, I'm going to say console.writeLine, just like I did before, and then I'm going to do the same thing. So Control F5. You can now see that there's this empty space right here. That's because what we just did something. We just wrote code that changed the output of our program. So now with this most basic understanding of kind of what this layout is, let's go ahead and get started with the topic of this unit, which is System I/O. So we've already kind of demonstrated the first step of System.io. It's printing an empty line. Very straightforward. All I'm doing is calling, so I mentioned that main is a method. .writeLine is also a method. You can tell if it's a method or not based on parentheses afterwards. If it has parentheses afterwards, it's going to be some sort of a method, sometimes a constructor, but most of the time it's going to be a method. Console is a static class. Like I said, program is a class. Console is a static class. It exists in itself. I don't have to create an instance of it. And we'll get more about that when the semester starts. For now, let's just focus on using the tools that we're given to do what we want to do. So console write line is, interesting. Let's say I put a bunch of these. So I'm going to put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As you can imagine, when I run my code, again, with Control F5, I'm going to get something like this. 1, 2, oops, I pressed a button. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it gives us 5 lines before it stops the program. And so just to kind of clarify also, the reason why I'm pressing Control F5 and not F5, as you can see here, there's start debugging and start without debugging. If I start debugging, it'll open the program and immediately close it. That's because it starts the program, gets to the end, realizes that there's no more code to run and stop. So it's a little bit different. I'll explain how to fix that later and kind of what the difference is more. But what we have right here, interesting. We're writing empty lines. Neat, cool. But let me show you something that's really cool with Visual Studio. So I'm going to type console.writeLine, and I'm going to put 1 parenthesis here. And as you can see, it gives me this cool IntelliSense with up and down arrows. So on my keypad, I'm going to press up and down, and you can see I've 19 options that I can pick here. 19 things that I can do. These are called method overloads. The one we're using before was just the first overload. Writes the current line terminator to the standard output stream, the enter key, essentially. That's exactly what this did. However, if I press down, it's asking for a parameter now. You can see that this value right here, it wants something in the parentheses. What it's going to do with the value in the parentheses is print it out. So let's find the string. So string value. So we're going to want to print something to the stream, something to the output. And a string is just a collection of letters. It's a word. And the way you dictate that in pretty much every programming language is through the use of quotations. So now if I just print this, it'll do exactly the same thing, but technically this is a string. And in these quotations, we can write text. Now, as I mentioned previously, the most basic entry-level hello world, or the most basic entry-level program is always hello world. This is something that almost every single intro-level programming class in whatever language, you're going to be doing this. You're going to be printing out these words to the console. So I'm going to press Control F5, and you're going to see that. I print out exactly what my console said it was going to print out. So console write line is kind of the first step to learning how to program. As we get into the more logic-based kind of algorithms and such, oftentimes you're going to want to use this tool to print things out, to print out variables. so that you can go in there and test something and see what your code is doing. Now, in this semester, we'll talk about the debugger, which allows you to step through your code line by line, but that's a little bit more complicated. So for now, we're just going to focus on using console print statements to help debug our code. So let's kind of take a look at the next step of this. So console write line, so I'm going to comment it out. By using 2 forward slashes, I'm saying that I want this code here, or I want this whatever here, this can just be words. Hi, my name is Ryan, something like that. But it's saying that this is not going to run. This is not going to compile. This is for me as the developer to help myself, or if I give this to somebody else to help them. But we're going to keep that there for now. The next step is to learn the other variations of tools that the console gives us. So the next one we're going to discuss is console.write. And, similarly, I get pretty much the same overloads. There's one missing. I'm not actually sure which one it is, but we still have the main one that we care about, which is string value. So let's type hello world in here again. And then let's try this. So I'm going to tell the world that my name is Ryan. This looks pretty straightforward. Do you have any, just off the top of your head, do you have any ideas of what this what this does? Think about it. But let's go ahead and run it. Wait a minute. That looks awful. There's hello world. It put 2 words together. It put the press any key to continue right next to it. This is terrible. This is ugly. What we did is console.write just slaps on the end of the buffer, the stream buffer, the stuff that I put in here. So hello world, my name is Ryan. It just puts it on the end of the buffer, which we don't want to do that. We want to organize this to be more attractive. So this is why you generally use write line. So just changing these to write line, I'm going to run it again. And this looks much more interesting. This looks like what we expected to do. This is more usable in our context. However, console.write has its uses. Let's say I want to print a sequence of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I could put this right here just in a console write line statement, but let's say these are all separate variables and I want to print them together. As we get into more interesting stuff, as we start programming more, you'll see why this will be useful. But if I do something like this, let's say 0, comma, space, and then copy this 5 times. 6 times actually, because 0 to 5 is 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the 5th one, we don't want anything after. We want to do this. But we do kind of have an issue now. Remember that, please press any key or whatever? That's going to come after this. We don't want that. We want it to be a line down. So I'm going to press the enter key, the code version of the enter key. So when I run this, it's exactly what you expect. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we've just used console.write in an interesting way that does exactly what we want it to do. It prints it out in a nice way that we can easily understand, that we can debug easily, and go from there. Let's say we did console write line. It works, but this isn't near as nice. What happens if you're printing many, many, many numbers? This just fills up the screen and it becomes a mess. So that's why we like this. So let's kind of talk about the next step here. So I'm going to go ahead and comment everything out, which this tool right here is definitely helpful with. Comment out the selected lines. Similarly, there's the one next to it, which is uncomment. So you could go back and forth. And then I'm going to remove these just to keep it clean. And let's go down a little bit. So we have printing to the console, neat and fine and dandy and everything cool. It's not the most amazing thing because we could just print to the console. We can't really do anything with that. So let's change that. The next thing we're going to look at is console.readLine. Now you can see here, there's no overloads for it. There's no up and down arrow that I can press. This has to just be an empty method call. It just has to be two parentheses right next to each other that has nothing in it. But you can see this value right here. This is a string. And remember I said, this right here is also a string. These are two variables which we'll be getting into next unit. But in order to use console readline, we need to understand what it's doing with the return type. So when I open this up again, you can see the return type is a string. Now, when we're using console.writeLine, you can see that its return type is void. Void essentially means nothing. It doesn't return anything. It's not gonna, it doesn't equal a value. It just does some code and done. Readline actually does some code, but it takes a value from that code. Specifically, it reads a string. Now, in order to do that, we need to store it in a variable. So, and again, we'll be getting into variables in the next topic, but I'm just going to show you a brief example now so that we can actually use console readline. So I'm going to say string my string, and I'm not going to set it equal to anything. I'm just going to, keep it just an empty variable. And you can see C# is really nice, and it tells us the variable my string is declared but never used. Again, Visual Studio basically writes your code for you. It's awesome. However, because we know readline, as you can see here, returns a string, we're going to set my string equal to whatever value comes from console readline. So I'm going to say my string equals. Okay, cool. Now we're in this great position. Let's go ahead and run our code and see what happens. It's empty. Nothing's going on here. What's happening is console readline has actually frozen our program. Our program is waiting for user input. More specifically, as I type, it's still waiting for me to input this into the system. So as soon as I press enter, it's going to continue like we've expected before with the press any key to continue. So it was frozen on this line of code, or this chunk of code right here specifically. It was frozen here waiting for me to do something. It was asking for my user input. I went in there, I put in my input, and it stored that user input into my string. Now, remember how I said earlier that this is a string? Well, this is also a string dictated by the typing over here. So let's do the obvious. So after I read whatever the input is from my end, I want to go ahead and print that value out. So let's go ahead and run it again. Remember, it's frozen here. It's waiting for me. It's saying console.readline. It's waiting for me to enter an input. So I'm going to put in hello world again. And when I press enter, it's going to print it back out to me. Now, strings have really cool things. I'm going to show you just a simple example of it to, show that this is actually doing something different. So my string is an object, and it has properties. It has methods and properties. It has a whole lot of things. And you can see all of these options when I put a period at the end. Now, what I want to do is I want to use the toUpper method. And I don't know if you guys saw that. So period, I press TOU, and you can see that it's highlighted right now. I just press enter, and it'll automatically finish the code. Again, Visual Studio writes all your code for you, believe me. ToUpper is a method, so we're going to put these parentheses here. And again, you don't need to know this. I'm just kind of demonstrating that, what this is doing and what this is doing is indeed different. So when I run my code again, it's frozen here. It's waiting for the line to be read. I'm going to say hello world with a capital H and a capital W. When I print it, it's going to print the entire thing in all caps because I used the toUpper method on top of it. So let's take this a little bit further. So the next step that we're going to talk about is the console.read key, but I want to show kind of why it's important, how it's interesting, so on and so forth. So if I run my code with debugging now, so instead of Control F5, I'm going to press F5. We're going to get the same thing where it freezes right here. I mean, you can see all these tools popped up, Visual Studio change colors and stuff. That's because Visual Studio is actively listening to my program. So I'm just going to type random characters, and then watch this. I'm going to press enter, and then boom, program just closes. When I'm debugging, as soon as it gets to the last line of code, it says, okay, I'm done. I'm going to close. When I press Control F5, however, it's just running the executable itself, as if you sent this to a friend and they're running it. this is what they would see. You know, they'd say hello. It's going to print hello in all caps because that's what we did, and it's going to ask for press any key to continue. So using Control F5 to run your code is nice. You know, it forces it to stop for you. It's not very helpful. You know, what if our code crashes? You know, let's actually demonstrate that real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and take this stuff, comment it out again because we want to use that later. And I'm going to say int my int nothing, my int equals console.readline. Now you can see here it says at the very bottom of this little window that popped up, it says cannot implicitly convert type string to int. It knows that console.readline returns a string, but I'm trying to put a string in an integer. This is what a strongly typed language does. A strongly typed language says that this variable has to be an integer. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It has to be an integer. It can't just all of a sudden change to a string. So trying to store a string in there doesn't work. But let's go ahead and, you know, this is another little foreshadowing, but I'm going to use int.parse. Int.parse is a method that, as you can see, if I mouse over it, it says int.parse string s. So it wants a string as a parameter, specifically what goes into the parentheses. So console read line, I know, returns a string. But yet, let's do it like this instead. Let's make it a little bit more clear. So I'm going to keep this, instead of printing this out, my string I'm going to say is a number. And then instead of parsing out a new read line, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to say my int equals int.parse my string. So whatever the value of my string is, because it's a string, I want to parse its value out and store it in an integer. However, and let's go ahead and let's print it out. However, we run into a situation where, what if my string is not an integer? You know, so let's run it. Let's Control F5 again. It's asking me for input. I'm going to say, you know, 42. I'm going to press enter. It's going to print out 42. Great, everything's all nice and dandy. Let's do the same thing, but I'm going to say hello. Hello is not a number. Hello is a string. It's a word. Oh my goodness! Kaboom! Our code exploded. You know, this right here has some useful information. This will tell us kind of what's going on, but it's not near as nice as what it could be. When I run the actual debugger, it's going to do a lot more. So what I'm going to do, just to kind of demonstrate, I'm just going to put another console read line down here just to stop my program from running. You know, instead of it just debugging through and continuing, I'm just going to put it here so it stops. Specifically, it won't stop though. So I pressed F5. Remember, I have all the debugging tools running right now. I press F5. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say hello again. Hello is not an integer. It wants an integer. So instead of crashing in here, it crashes in Visual Studio itself. It tells me the exact line of code it crashed on. It tells me exactly the problem. Input string was not in the correct format. It's super useful. You know, 99.999% of the time, you should be using start debugging. You should not be using start without debugging. You should always use start debugging because it'll break right where your code needs the help. So we've determined that running while debugging is very useful. However, we don't, you know, without this kind of hacked out console read line at the end just to catch something, you know, it's always gonna stop the program. So I'm gonna run it. I'm gonna come here. I'm gonna say, you know, 42 because that's an actual integer, and then it's just gonna close my program. Let's create something that sort of mimics what Visual Studio does whenever we press Control F5, or what the executable does, I should say. So console.writeLine, press any key to continue. So I'm going to go down here. I'm going to say press any key to continue, and then console.read key. Oops. Now, read key is a little bit different than read line. With the read key, as soon as I press a button, doesn't matter what button it is, it's just going to trigger and close, or trigger and, you know, continue. So if there's another one, you know, console.writeLine hi. If I run this with Control F5, it's going to ask for an integer. I'm going to put in a 42. It's gonna then, so this is my press any key to continue. This is not what you guys have seen before, and I need to include the 3 periods there. But now it's asking for a key, and then as soon as I press this, this is their version. This is their version of what they, you know, what we're trying to mimic basically. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to mimic this, put that there, and then remove this. We just want this to be the same thing. So I'm going to press F5 now. I'm actually going to run with debugging. 42, press any key to continue. So this is my version. This is not their version. I'm going to press enter. It's going to close my program. Very straightforward, very simple. So now that we're here, we've kind of touched all the bases of the 4 main tools that you're going to need to know for I/O. You know, I/O includes a lot of things like reading from a file, writing to a file, things like that. We're not going to worry about that too much in this online course. We will get to that into the semester, but it's a little bit too complicated for now, and we don't need it for what we're trying to do. So let's kind of use this in a real applicable state. So you notice how I kept this down here? I want to run as debugging, but I want to catch myself from ending my program. So I'm going to keep this here always. So let's show kind of an example of what we can do with this. You know, beforehand, I was just running the console and I knew what it was asking for. I knew that it was asking for an integer because, you know, I could read my code. Imagine this was, you know, you gave this to a friend and it just pops up with a black box that is doing nothing. It's kind of confusing. You know, you should always prompt the user with what they need to do. So I'm going to start off by saying console.writeLine. And again, you can see right here I have a spelling error. I have, you know, lowercase letters. C# is case sensitive, so it needs to be very specific. As soon as I put the parenthesis, it just defaults to capital letters. You know, Visual Studio is awesome. It takes care of you. Believe me, it's way better than a lot of other IDEs out there. But let's go ahead and prompt the user. So I'm going to say, please enter an integer. Drop it off with a colon. And here's another useful situation for console.write. So if I run this and I'm going to say int my int equals int.parse console.readline. Now that right there is kind of a lot. One line of code does like many different things. Let's go ahead and split that out. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this out so I don't have any errors. So declaration of an integer variable. Let's get a string. So we're going to have string my string equals console.readline. So we're going to get input from the reader, and then we're going to store my int equals .parse my string. So this line of code does all 3 lines of code right here. However, we don't actually have to create a variable to store my string. We just want to store it in my integer. So just for clarification's sake, this is what's happening right here. So let's get rid of that. So now this is going to ask me for an integer, and I'm going to put it in there. Let's go ahead and run it. So, you know, this is nice and all, but, you know, I would prefer this be right here. It'd make more sense. However, if I still run it, you know, it'll still run through and continue. This is where console.write really comes into play. When I run this code here, it looks more normal. You know, I'm putting my input right here. So, you know, 3479. You know, very straightforward. That's what I want to input, and it's going to continue. So now, let's say I just want to confirm to the user they've input a number. So right here, I could say console.write, you have entered value. So we've only used strings before here, but remember, console.write, if I go down, you can eventually find a point where it wants an integer. So there is an overload for this. All this is going to do is take the stringified version of an integer and print it. But remember, you know, we don't want to print this and then immediately afterwards have this. This is what that would look like. You know, that's ugly. That's no fun. We're not going to do that. So I can just change this to a write line and we're good to go. So now please enter an integer, 23. You have entered a value, 23. Very straightforward, very simple. easy to go from here. One last thing I want to talk about is a feature called string concatenation. So right here I have 2 lines of code that does this. What if I wanted another thing after it that says congratulations? Neat. And let's change this to that. So it's going to say you have entered value, my integer, congratulations. I'm going to run it, place an integer 5. It's going to say you have entered value 5, congratulations. It works, it looks good on the user end, but this is a whole lot of code. This is 3 lines of code with a whole bunch of extra method calls that we don't really want to do. So instead, let's look at string concatenation. So string concatenation is literally the addition of strings. So I'm going to put a plus here because I want to add this string and the string after it, my int. Now, after my int, I also want to add congratulations, but I just can't type, congratulations, it doesn't exist. I need to add another string to this that says congratulations. Now, both these lines can go away, and I can change this to write line because I want it to write on one line. So this is going to be exactly the same thing when it's all said and done with. But it's one line of code, it's nicer. I use these plus signs to go from here. And again, this is kind of a little additional feature. This has not much to do with I/O, but this is something that you're going to be using a lot throughout this course. So that pretty much covers everything that we're going to need for this unit. As we get deeper on into the other units, we're going to come back to system I/O a lot. Very often, you're going to need to ask the user for input. Very often, you're going to need to provide instructions to the user. What next? What happens next? Things like that. So our next video will be covering variables, which we can use in this kind of sense to get a lot more deeper into it. So let's go ahead and take a look at that one.